Thank you for inviting me here tonight at Royal Geographical Society. We all live at the water's edge, even though some of us are not aware of it. Whether we're on the banks of the river or at the end of a very long pipeline, we use water to nourish our crops, produce energy for watering industry, and to see our basic needs. Now, we often hear about the global water crisis driven by explosive population growth, the demands of tremendous increases in demands from agriculture, industry, energy production, and the looming impacts of climate change. But the crisis is much talked about and not often very clearly understood. So tonight, I hope we come out of this with a better understanding together. And Andy and I and George said earlier, we hope we learn something as well out of this. So first of all, I want to talk about what the sort of water crisis actually is. What are the consequences of this water crisis for ourselves, our planet, if we don't act boldly and pretty soon to avert it? What the roots of the crisis are, and then finally present a sort of new ethic on water stewardship, responsibility that we must all accept to avert the crisis and to save potentially billions of people from water scarcity while meeting the food, fibre and energy needs that we all have. So you've all seen this before, I'm sure, in your early textbooks, but it's just to demonstrate that less than 0.5% of the water in the planet is actually available for use, for our use. The rest of the fresh water is locked up in glaciers, ice, and deep underground aquifers. But out of that tiny percentage, it's an indispersible resource, and without it, we wouldn't be here, and the world wouldn't be like it is. It falls from the sky, gathers in lakes, aquifers, and is most visibly perhaps in rivers. And I want to focus a little bit on rivers tonight because that's very dear to WWF's heart. So this was a river. This was the Gambhiri River in North India, a tributary to the Ganga. And not a drop of water has run down this river for 5 years. And that's actually because of damming and use for irrigation. So you can see it used to be quite a substantial river. And meanwhile, over 100 communities downstream are doing what they can to desperately scramble to secure water resources. In the 1990s, the once mighty Yellow River in China actually stopped flowing before it reached the sea. And in its peak in 1997, it's actually 227 days without flowing, without reaching the sea. This is Lake Chad. You may have seen similar diagrams from the Aral Sea, but you can see there over just under 40 years how the lake has diminished through anthropogenic factors. So sadly, these aren't isolated cases, and it's a similar story around the world, and we're seeing that in rivers and lakes everywhere, really. And the question is, why are they running dry? Well, it's actually a fairly simple answer, and that's we're taking too much water out of them for too long. And we've disrupted the sort of cycles, the ebbs and flow, the wet season, dry seasons, and replaced them with the sort of replaced natural rhythms of rivers with artificial ones. Then, of course, people migrate to cities. Cities need agriculture, and agriculture is the most polluting industry in the world. And incomes rise in cities, and people want to consume more. And these little pictures perhaps represent quite water-consumptive items. A lot of that's actually shipped overseas, which for international trade, which we'll talk about later, and that encourages more agriculture and big irrigation systems. Groundwater starts to reduce rapidly. Of course, there's industry there as well, and industry is, in many places, heavily polluting. Throw in some deforestation, which goes on in a lot of the world, and you've got sediment running off, topsoil runoff into rivers and lakes and streams, clogging them up. Wetlands die out, and dams appear. Fish disappear. Some communities won't get access to water anymore. Oh, and I forgot to mention, this is actually two countries. There's one upstream, one downstream here, and the one upstream also wants to consume a lot and grow. Some river basins, actually the Danube is the most shared river basin in the world, with 19 countries actually sharing the river basin. Groundwater will disappear a bit more, seawater will come in. Sun doesn't get bigger, but temperature rises. And sea levels potentially increase, sea levels rise, sorry, and that can have a huge effect on drinking water impacts and so on. And glaciers melt. I read today when I was researching this talk or doing some reading around it, that the Tibetan, over half the world's population rely on glacier melt from the Tibetan Plateau. So if glaciers melt, there could be a lot of big problems there. I don't know if you caught that one, but the lake gets smaller and the river often doesn't reach the sea, which causes more problems with saltwater intrusion. You've got precipitation extremes, which are very likely from climate change. Well, the solution, pipe water in from another river basin, or that's what some people think. But it could be pipe water out of that river basin to another river basin that's more strategic for the government. So actually, often the responses to problems can cause more damage than good. This is a satellite image of the Indus in Pakistan. It's the world's largest contiguous irrigation system, and it's seen from space. There's this huge green swathe of literally the desert in bloom. And it's a massive source of food and livelihoods, and basically the economy for the 160 million people that live in Pakistan and pretty much entirely depend on that huge irrigation system. So irrigation is sort of one of the marvels of the modern world, and it's really one of the reasons why we have been so successful as a human race. But it also comes at a cost, and that's the cost often to our rivers. This is the actual river, the Indus River Delta, and as I said before, that often these things are sort of not reaching the sea, and you can see there, for example, a boat. It's not just a tidal system, I promise. It's actually, that's the river not really reaching the sea. That's actually had a huge impact on a lot of people's lives in recent years, and it was once a mighty river. So that's caused a lot of saltwater intrusion for thousands of communities, destroyed drinking water supplies, and it's been devastating to farmlands. So thousands of communities have been forced to migrate because of this river basically drying up and not reaching the sea, and there's been a lot of violent conflict and so on. Not stuff you perhaps hear on the 6 o'clock news, but there has been a lot going on on a smaller scale. So this is what we see happens if we mismanage our kind of voracious appetite for water. The effect on biodiversity is also very visible in many places. These were Indus River dolphins, one of the rarest species in the world, and I think is one of the most endangered crustacean species in the world. The future for these guys is looking pretty grim as things are going. The Yangtze River dolphin, there was a huge survey done on the Yangtze a number of years ago, and they haven't found any river dolphins alive anymore. They're very sensitive to pollution, which was caused by cotton farming in this case, largely. So there are implications for all freshwater ecosystems. Fresh rivers, lakes, and wetlands cover less than 0.1% of the world's surface area, but it's home to 40% of all fish species. And when you add amphibians, associated water birds, reptiles, and mammals to the list, it adds up to 1/3 of all global vertebrate species living in or on the river. And this, unfortunately, is the species in fastest decline out of any species. This is the Living Planet Index that WWF produce. And it shows here that freshwater species have decreased 50% in the last 30 years, up to 2000. And that continues to go down even now, unfortunately. So where is affected? Well, this is, maps are a bit like statistics, which are a bit like graphs. They tell different stories depending on what they're showing. And this shows, in red, the areas where there's extremely high water stress. That means over 80% of the total withdrawals of total renewable supply is withdrawn every year. So it's a huge stress on the areas. But to get the real picture, we have to look at this sort of strip of the map, if you like. And this is really where the water crisis is going to hit the hardest. This is home to 2/3 of the world population currently, and it's where a lot of the predicted growth will be. And it's also where demand for water is rising most rapidly, and a lot of where our food is produced. So here the problem is very real. As George was alluding to earlier, that the problem is actually very real for a lot of people now. It's not a future problem. It's not a crisis in the future. It's happening now. And things are only going to get worse, unfortunately, in the short term at least. The population is going to be 9 billion in 2050, and 7 billion people in 60 countries are going to live in areas of water scarcity. So just this week, the Director General of the FAO announced that agricultural output is going to need to double to feed that 9 billion population. So from where it is today, agricultural output is going to have to double. So how are we involved in the crisis? Well, WWF last year published a water footprint for the UK, and it looked at 3 elements of water footprint. Green water, that's rain-fed. Blue water, that's water abstracted. And grey water, that's the water needed to dilute pollutants to return back into the environment. And this is what it came up with. 4,645 litres per person per day is what we use in the UK in virtual water. And that's water embedded in agricultural products, cotton, industrial products, and household water, which is obviously a very small amount proportion. And what we also found out was that 62% of this is actually imported. So we're 62% effectively dependent on the rest of the world to supply our virtual water. And that makes us the 6th largest net importer globally. So this is where we're impacting on. Largest is Brazil, but there's very large impacts on India and the US and lots of other areas of the world. And the smaller map here is Europe. So you can see there that France, Spain, Germany, and Italy supply us with a lot of virtual water as well. And the reason the arrows are backwards on this is to show where we're actually impacting, where, although the arrows could be in reverse to show where the food's coming from, it's actually showing this is where our water footprint is. So what this has meant is that people have actually woken up to this fact that there's a huge risk, potentially, of running out of water, and a risk for us all. We're not just sitting here in a damp country and we're fine. It actually could affect us. And what we've also realized is that we're inadvertently contributing to social and economic and massive environmental problems in many of the poorer areas of the world. And we rely on food from very poorly governed river basins. And like I said, there's this whole kind of interest growing from corporates and government to mitigate water risk. So water risks come from too much, too little, or poor quality water, the consequences of these situations, so what that means for the people, and the consequences of the responses to these situations. So that could, remember the pipe transfer that was flashing blue at the end of that very colourful slide? That's perhaps a big water risk. How are people going to respond to that? And water risks are shared risks. So they're shared by people, they're shared by government, they're shared by nature, they're shared by business. So very quickly, there's different types of water risk. And first one is physical water risk, which we've been discussing. The other is financial cost implications for people. That's a risk. Regulatory risk, if you're regulated by the government or a regulator, that can have an impact if regulations come, a change in rules of the game. Political risk. Water is highly, highly political in many places. In 2006 in the UK, I had the fortune of working for Thames Water as drought communications coordinator. And believe me, water gets very political when it starts to run out. Otherwise, no one really bothers about it. There's a reputational risk. A lot of people have a reputation at stake, and a social risk, and that can include things like conflict, as I mentioned earlier. So we're looking at a new water stewardship ethic, and this is where we see a large part of the solution line. And we need to, first of all, we feel, protect rivers and groundwater and wetlands and associated water bodies. But we need to make sure that we're not destroying the very rivers that provide us with a lot of all the services like irrigation and flushing and industrial services and so on. And we need to make sure laws are sufficient, that water is retained in rivers to sustain wildlife as well, because that's often the part that loses out. And it underpins fresh water. So such laws are already in place in South Africa, Kenya, Mexico, and so on, but it's actually getting them implemented that's one of the challenges. And we must use ingenuity to look at the amount of water we take from natural systems to feed ourselves. So a lot of the current thinking is that what's going to have to feed the world's population at 9 billion is going to come from improving efficiency in rain-fed agriculture. And if you just look here, this is something I pulled out of International Water Management Institute study, and it shows here that this is crop yield in terms of maize tons of maize per hectare of land, and this is over time, and you can actually see where a lot of people are going to be looking for the increased food to come from perhaps in future. And we said that if you can actually bring up these guys up to 80% of what the best are doing, you can actually solve 75, you'll be able to feed the 75% of the extra need in 2050. There's also sort of the possibility of new varieties of crops and new techniques and technological advances. And then there's a sort of corporate stewardship whole role that hopefully we'll hear from Andy about, and that's about how to increase production without increasing freshwater use or reducing impacts on freshwater systems. And businesses have a real role to play in leadership here. And we need agreements on transboundary water resources, and there's already regional agreements in place in Southern Africa, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. And there's also a global treaty coming together. That's from the UN General Assembly, and that's waiting for ratification from the member states. So we also need clear standards for dam siting. I didn't talk much about dams, but they have a massive impact. And hydropower is going to be looked at increasingly as a source of energy, so we need to deal with that. And underlying all that, we need there's the need for strong, well-resourced and politically independent institutions to ensure that water and ecosystems are really put at the heart of what we're trying to do here, and making sure that interests of the poor aren't marginalized as well. So there's lots of encouraging signs out there, and but the fate of water and the water crisis is far from sealed at this stage. The main problem being there's a lack of understanding of what the issues are involved and what the core issues are. There's a growing recognition of the importance of water, but often the need for reforms is choked to death by politically powerful actors who've got a real interest in keeping things in the status quo. So just to summarize, well, just to end really, that water is a tiny part of our world, fresh water, but it has massive, massive implications. And it creates life, defines our deepest cultural rituals, and supports some of the world's most fragile natural wonders. But it also encapsulates perhaps the most challenging, the biggest challenge that mankind will ever face. Thank you very much.